One of the things that's going on that is huge news globally, but very, very few people have heard about it in the U.S., is the African swine fever going on in China. And what was interesting was when we were talking last night and you were telling me about how this impacted pig farmers. So just as a little bit of background, there is a disease that is in China right now that has killed, it's interesting to say it has killed or the farmers have had to cull their herd, which is something like 20% of all of China's pig production. At least that's the official estimates. Mm-hmm. So there's a disease that gets into the barns and the pigs either die or you say they are going to die and we don't want it to spread. So we're gonna cull the herd. But that had an interesting impact on the dairy world. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So a lot of whey products actually go to China to feed pigs in the first, I believe, 3 or 4 weeks of their life. And they're good at converting that whey into pork and growing of the piglet. And so we export quite a bit of that whey. And so just from what we're seeing as far as a reduction of whey and some of the other commodities that go into feeding hogs, particularly soybeans, and some of that is related to tariffs and trade wars, but there are people that are saying the number of hogs is more than the 20% that's being reported by the Chinese government. I mean, there's estimates that it could be as high as 50%.
50%?
Yeah, and so we have a close family friend actually that's involved in a company in China, and they own several of these hog hotels. They build hotels straight up in the air. And they house their pigs in there. And I believe 3 of them, they got African swine flu in. Is it flu or fever?
I believe fever.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the fever. It got in 3 of their hog barns, and one of them, it killed every single pig in there in a matter of 2 days. And then the other ones, they had the Chinese officials come out, and they looked at the pigs, and they said, oh, it's not African swine fever, but go ahead and euthanize everybody. And so there is a cover-up on the part of the Chinese because it has huge implications for feeding their people, and it's a potential wild card for the trade war with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's people like to give a sense of perspective. When they were saying between 20 to 30% of the Chinese herd, mm-hmm. that would represent if you slaughtered every single pig that was in the United States is how many that China has lost, and we raise a lot of hogs in the United States.
Absolutely. It's going to have ripple effects for a long time. And so the question is, how are the Chinese people going to deal with this? Because they're going to see animal proteins start being eradicated and eliminated from their diets. And then what sort of ripple effects does it have on pork price or on pork prices here, but also the cattle market, and then also on the chicken market? I mean, to me, it's shaping up where it's going to be a huge run-up in prices at some point. The feeder market recently has collapsed and fallen apart, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but and some of it is China just hasn't come to the table and started buying these animal proteins yet. They're still in the middle of the trade war, and you know, as wild and crazy as Donald Trump is at times, China is too, and they truly believe that they are in a war with the American people, and the Chinese have a history of sacrificing their own people without cause. And so there's been reports already of rounding
without
up.
Cause? What do you mean?
So as it stands right now, I believe in the more western parts of China, that's what this relative was saying too, they're rounding up the more prominent Muslims and Christians and putting them in labor camps to eliminate some of the people that are voices that would be potentially contrary to the communist movement. And they're not afraid to take dissidents and put them in concentration camps to keep a hold of them. And I don't know if it would come to a point of starvation, but I think they'd be willing to sacrifice people going hungry in order to not give up the trade war or to sacrifice too much on that end.
There's definitely a very different mindset in the Chinese culture than say the Western American culture. So I helped a professor when I was in graduate school write a book called Never Forget National Humiliation. And it was the 100 years, never forget the 100 years of national humiliation. And it was actually describing what the Chinese people went through for 100 years of various colonizers coming in, whether it was the Japanese or the British, and describing how now in current day, they teach their students how they were subjugated by other cultures, and that they will never do that again, and that the way that you keep that from happening is by taking collective action, that we all work together. And the whole book is around designing their foreign policy. So how do you get a group of, 1 billion Chinese to row in the same direction? And one of the interesting things that came from working with Zhang Wang, the professor that I worked with, was that he said the Chinese economy and government is like the bus in the movie Speed, where it has to always go at 55 miles an hour. And if you go below that, then you hit some red line and the bomb goes off underneath. And what he's saying is that the government has put themselves in the position that they have helped raise the standard of living for the Chinese people so much. But even more than that, the people that haven't had their standard of living raised, they're watching the economy go up. And one of the ways that you know that the economy is getting better is how much meat you get access to. So it used to be you would have meat only on holidays, and then they got better so they could have it once a month, and then they could have it once a week, and then some people are having it every day. And if you're a peasant that has gone from eating meat a couple times a year to now having it once a week, you feel a lot wealthier. And you think about something like the swine fever coming through and culling a huge percentage. I mean, 50%, if what you're saying is right, that really makes for a very unstable situation. That I think that most people in the United States are not aware is going on.
Absolutely. I mean, the communist government, their one job is to keep the bellies full in China, right? And that's what separates them between massive political unrest. And this has kind of been a cog that's been yanked out that is going to be a challenge for them and could potentially force them to the negotiating table quite a bit quicker. And you speak about the need for continuing to grow. I mean, there's entire cities that have been built and roads that have been built just to keep people busy, to keep people employed in China, because they recognize the need to keep the people working. And that's also why they're fighting so hard to maintain the manufacturing in their country, because they need to keep people working and keep people employed. And if they don't have that, then they have political unrest.
So what is the status of the trade wars with China or with Canada right now from the dairy farmers' perspective?
Yeah, so we're still waiting for the codifying of the USMCA. It needs to pass Congress.
That's the replacement for NAFTA?
It is. And so Mexico, I believe, they've signed off on it and approved it. And it seems like there's some contention on pushing it through Congress on our end. And it would be a win. It would be a win for the dairy industry. It gives some access to the Canadian industry and prevents them from dumping some protein powders and milk powders on the global market. And so that's been good for us. As far as the trade wars with China, it has impacted the American dairy industry, particularly the co-op that I sell milk to. Dairy Gold, we had set up a year and a half ago an office in China, and we haven't been able to sell anything into China because of the high tariffs on our products going overseas. And then there's always an argument, too, that, China's still consuming dairy products. They're just buying them from other parts of the world, and so it does eliminate or use up some of the inventories. But it would be nice, particularly for us on a local level, to be exporting to China. And I think for the most part, the farmers as a whole have been behind China, and they are behind Donald Trump, and they recognize, China has been taking advantage of us. They're currency manipulators. They've been stealing IP, and they've not played by the rules. And quite frankly, they had an agreement, and then China reneged on that agreement. And so we're seeing a history of China being China. That being said, I think the American farmer can only afford to back Donald Trump for so long before they start saying, I need to vote with my pocketbook. And my pocketbook has suffered because of this trade war unfairly. I think when you look at a global or the United States as a whole, yeah, it's in our best interest to have this fight. But we don't think like the Chinese people. We're very much segmented into why are we fighting the battle for intellectual property when myself as a soybean farmer or dairy farmer, we're struggling and our prices are below the cost of production. And so, yeah, it'd be interesting to see one. And there's always movement. I mean, reading this morning again that trade representatives are going back to China, and we'll see if they make a deal. And it's been discouraging. It's been a lot of hope and just no action. And probably a lot of it's justified. I do believe that China is continuing to change the rules, and they've been playing by their own rule book now like they have been for the last 20 or 30 years.
So 2020 rolls around. Who is the next president of the United States?
Ooh. If the Democrats continue to go with crazy on the far outskirts, I think it is Donald Trump. I think if they were to put forward a moderate, they'd be able to win the hearts and minds of the people, and they'd get it. But pushing the socialist agenda, I think it still doesn't fly with the majority of the country.
Interesting. I mean, it was when the election was going on, I was traveling around to dozens of farmer events and giving talks, and I definitely did not predict that Donald Trump would win the election, but I was like, something's going on here. Like, I would come back to St. Louis and be like, I don't think you guys get it. I think that there's a lot more support for Donald Trump out in the countryside than most people realize, but even I had no idea how much.
Right. And China has already verbalized this, and they know that they are striking at the heart of Donald Trump's base with this trade war, because China is also looking at the long term. They think generationally. They don't think in a 4-year cycle. And so really they're hoping to make it just through the end of the Donald Trump presidency, and hoping for a Democrat that will cave on a lot of the demands from the U.S. trade negotiators.
Very interesting. Well, we'll see how that plays out.